So what do you know about Charles Manson's mother anyway? Probably nothing. I bet little. And what you do know probably came from Helter Skelter. But was that even true? Most of the stuff written in that book, you can find out that it was pretty much fabricated, if not just made up. So, why should you listen to me then? Because I know more about Manson than the whole damn internet does. Welcome to the Back Porch Tapes. Come on in, have a seat. Have a seat right here. And let's talk about Charles Manson's mom, Kathleen Maddox. You won't have to believe my account of it because we'll be looking at 4 different articles that were written about Charles Manson's mom. 2 of them she was interviewed for. Just the facts here. Did I mention that she was an alcoholic too? She was also put in prison just like her son. And just like her son, she tells the story that she was falsely convicted just like he was. Yeah, seriously. That's her story. Here's a picture of Charlie when he was younger. And let's put that up there with the article about his mom. Here's another one. Another picture of him. Let's put that one up there too. So let's look at this article about Charles Manson's mom. She looks older than 53, feels 90, she says. Thin and slightly hunched from emphysema that keeps her from working, she still smokes heavily. Sometimes, when the fear keeps her sitting up all night in the dark living room, tiredness the next day knocks her mind off guard. Then the constant tension catches her in spasms, making her shake so badly she can hardly pick up a teacup or light her cigarettes. She is the mother of Charles Manson. Since his arrest in November 1969 for the slaying of actress Sharon Tate and 6 others, she has heard herself described as the worst kind of tramp and bad mother whose son went bad because he was so cruelly deprived. If anything, it was just the opposite, she knows. But she kept silent and hidden, thinking back over the past and realizing, she says now, that her worst mistake with her infamous son was an overindulgence that became the law of life, even a necessity to Charles Manson. In the Charles Manson who sent his disciples out to kill, she can recognize one strong trait in the little boy she remembers. The charming boy who never worked or fought for what he really wanted, but let others, usually women, do it for him. Mrs. Manson speaks frankly about her past, denying some parts and admitting others in a thin, weary voice that retains the country accent of her native Ashland, Kentucky. Charles was born out of wedlock, she admits, but it wasn't just any man. I wasn't a prostitute. I've never been a prostitute. I was just 15 years old and a dumb kid. I was Miss Dumb, but my mother was a very strict woman, very religious, and didn't allow smoking or drinking or even movies. So when me and my sister got a few years on us, I guess we had a tendency to be a little wild, the way kids will. But I didn't go around with men that way. And when Charles came along, that had happened twice in my life. And I really was in love with Colonel Scott. He was a lot older than me, 24, and he loved me too. Mrs. Manson begins to cry, but continues. Her mother sent her with her sister to Cincinnati to have the baby away from Ashland. And while awaiting the baby, she accepted the marriage proposal of William Manson so the baby would have a name. The baby was born November the 11th, 1934, and was listed on the birth certificate as No Name Maddox after his mother's maiden name. But that was not out of indifference, Mrs. Manson says. but because she was awaiting the arrival of her own mother in Cincinnati. When Charles was 4, Mrs. Manson left Ashland for McMecken, West Virginia, and the boy's contact with his real father was broken. But always he was surrounded by family, his mother, his grandmother, an aunt, and an uncle. It was during this time that Mrs. Manson and her older brother went to prison for 2 years. When Charles was 6, she was 22. She and her brother and an older woman who later married her brother robbed a man. She admits and went to prison instead of her future sister-in-law because the woman and Mrs. Manson's brother persuaded Mrs. Manson that the other woman could do more to secure their release if the other woman remained free. Charles was 8 when Mrs. Manson got out. But throughout those early years, she says, Charles was not only not neglected, he was even pampered by all the women who surrounded him. Charles was never a rough little boy. He was too tender-hearted to fight or do anything violent. He wouldn't even whip his dog. He wouldn't even fight his own battles. He had a girl cousin just about his age, and if he got in trouble, she'd always step in and fight for him. Maybe it was because my own mother had been so strict, but if Charles wanted anything, I'd give it to him. My mother did too. She eased up a bit as she got older. If Charles wanted money to go to the pictures, he'd come get it from me. And then he'd get it from his grandmother and from my sister too. He never had to do a thing to earn what he wanted. Those stories about him earning his own living selling newspapers when he was 7 or 8, those aren't true. He didn't even have to do things around the house, like rake leaves or mow lawns. Let me tell you this right now. Until Charles Manson came to California when he was about 21, he never worked a whole day in his life. But by the time Charles was 10, he had already begun running away from home. Mrs. Manson doesn't know why. But he did it repeatedly when he was living with her, when he was living with aunt and uncle, and later from correctional institutions. By the time Charles was 21, he had served several reformatories and finally a prison term for car theft. Paroled, he came home where he took menial jobs that he always lost through lateness, absence, or general neglect. And his mother or grandmother or aunts always came through with the money he needed. Sometimes I'd ask him to help me out in the restaurants I worked, Mrs. Manson recalls, but he wouldn't even mop the floor or wash dishes. Not Charles, and somehow I never made him. Well, here we look at school records of Charlie from back then that they put in the newspaper, and it sounds like his mom might have been lying. It sounds like they found out that she was arrested 3 different times. Let's read this. Manson was a student at Kanoa. Charles Manson, the bearded leader of the hippie group involved in the murder of Sharon Tate, was once a student in Kanoa County Schools. Record of Manson being in Charleston go back to World War II. At one point in the war, school children were fingerprinted to aid in their identification if the need ever arose. In 1943, Manson was fingerprinted. His age was listed as 8, and his residence was listed as 110 Central Avenue. His birthplace was given as Cincinnati. The only relative named on Manson's card was his mother, Miss Kathleen Manson. Her address was given as Cincinnati. Other records show that the mother was arrested several times and that in 1940 she was sentenced to 5 years in the state penitentiary on a charge of unarmed robbery. In 1939, Mrs. Manson was arrested by state police in Charleston and charged with armed robbery. In 1943, she was arrested again by state police and here and charged with grand larceny. The records do not show the disposition of the 2 charges. At one time or another, the records show Kathleen Maddox also used the names Kathleen Vernon, Kathleen McTean, and Kathleen Maddox. This is the crime that Charles Manson's mother committed, where she was sentenced to 5 years in the Moundsville State Penitentiary, along with her brother, Luther Maddox, who was sentenced to 10 years in the penitentiary. And they committed their crime in August, just like Charlie did. And their crime even had a name too. It was called the ketchup bottle holdup. Man and girl get Hold-up terms. Robbery with bottle as weapon cited. Charleston's ketchup bottle holdup of August 2nd netted its perpetrators prison terms in intermediate court Wednesday as Kathleen Manson and her brother Luther Maddox, formerly of Ashland, Kentucky, pleaded guilty to a charge of robbing Frank Martin of Charleston of 335, using a ketchup bottle filled with salt as the weapon. Judge D. Jackson Savage sentenced Kathleen 20 to a 5-year term on a charge of unarmed robbery, while Maddox, 23, brother of the girl, received a 10-year term on charge of armed robbery. According to the police accounts, Maddox and the Manson girl confessed to riding with Martin to the point near Stop 6 on the Dunbar line, where one of them stuck the ketchup bottle in his back and forced him to alight from his car. As Martin stepped to the ground, he was knocked unconscious with the bottle, and the pair drove away in his auto after taking $35 from the unconscious man. Okay, now I have a better idea how the crime went down. Kathleen, 16 years old at the time, sitting in a bar, restaurant type bar, goes up to a guy, an older guy, a much older guy, and says, "Hey, let's go out to your car." And the much older guy says, and they go out to the car. When they get out to the car, he gets in, she gets in the other side, and what's he going to do with this little 16-year-old girl in the car? He isn't going to do anything with her because Luther jumps in the back seat, along with his girlfriend on the other side, his soon-to-be wife. Luther, from the restaurant, brings a ketchup bottle. The ketchup bottle is full of salt, which, when you jam it in this guy's back, it feels like a gun. So now, of course, this guy is just driving down the freeway, take them anywhere they want to go. He gets out of the car. Luther takes that same ketchup bottle, and now that guy doesn't have a car or $35 anymore. And Kathleen gets 5 years in the penitentiary for luring this guy out. That sounds like a bad deal to me. It sounds like maybe they should have looked at why this guy was going out to the car with a 16-year-old girl. And in 1969, the LA Times would report the story like this. And notice the little twist that they put on it. When trouble came looking for Charles Miller Manson the day he was born, out of wedlock to a teenage mother and a father he never laid eyes on. The place? Cincinnati. The date? November the 11th, 1934. Not long after, he experienced life's second cruelty. His mother, who bore him when she was 16, went to prison, convicted along with her brother of beating up and robbing dates she hustled in riverfront bars. Ahead lay long years of trouble, which accumulated this week when Charles Manson was identified as the evil mastermind of the renegade hippie band suspected of murdering actress Sharon Tate and perhaps 10 other persons. After his mother's imprisonment, the little boy who would become the leader of that violent band went to live in McMecken, West Virginia, first with his maternal grandmother, then with an uncle and an aunt who had a sour marriage and gave him little affection. When he was 8, his mother got out of prison and he joined her. She drank and lived with a succession of men in seedy apartments. The men paid little attention to him, the mother not much more. He spent most of his time indoors alone. In 1945, the mother followed a traveling salesman to Indianapolis and they took the boy along with them. 2 years later, she tried to farm her son out to foster parents, as she occasionally had done before. But this time, the law moved in. Young Manson was made a ward of the county and sent off to Gibault School for Boys, a caretaking institution. So that's the story of Kathleen Maddox. Somebody asked me if they thought my garage was haunted, if I thought my garage was haunted. And I said, yeah. It still has sounds in it from the Manson family. Hear that creaking sound? This chair belonged to TJ. And think about it. The same sounds that he heard, we're hearing right now. It's kind of haunting, actually. But before we go, I've seen something on the internet. Rather than talking crap about all the time, I found something good on the internet. It has to do with Manson too. If you have a second, check this guy's music out. He plays the drums, and he does all kinds of Manson covers. And he does them in a way that are kind of honky-tonk. You could almost dance to him. Check him out. Here, I'll show you the link right now. And until next time, peace.
It's not where you're not free. Your home is where you can be what you are, 'cause you